Albanian Kosovo and its military forces, the groups involved would be between the KOA and the response from the Yugoslav/Serb authorities. KOA largely aggravated and started many fights in which the Yugoslav and Serb authorities simply had to respond. In 1988, there were more attacks on Serbian policemen. However, these events could not be seen as technical war. The KOA waged a war of revenge which only intensified the conflict. Reports of Serbs and Roma disappearing, unexplained local disappearances of local Serbs when KOA members took over these villages and areas. Albanian population was taking very heavy losses when the U.S. tried to intervene and gain more information. There was more heavy fighting between the KOA units and the Yugoslav forces as borders opened. For example, by September 1988, the UN Security Councils passed calling for a quote-unquote ceasefire and the withdrawal of Yugoslav forces. In conclusion, the impact led to between March and June, the KOA were unable to prevent displacement of about 90% of their people from being driven out. The KOA succeeded in some of their goals, but due to the withdrawal of Serb/Yugoslav forces, no immediate independence was brought. The Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, the groups that overall were at main were the Milosevic insufficient efforts to eradicate the KOA, leading to Fry and Albanian forces becoming more aware of one another. The impact of these groups was a lot of guerrilla war-style fights, which led to outrage, which led to quote-unquote clearing areas, sympathetic to the KOA. Due to the ethnic tension of centuries of build-up caused Serbia to see no legitimacy in the Albanian cause of intensification. These interactions led to international security by the Serbs, incursions into Albania by Serbs forces, and in 1989, heavy fighting resulting in killing and displacement of Albanian and refugees. The nature of the involvement eventually involved the U.S. with threats of brutal airstrikes and ultimately led to a withdrawal of 6,000 soldiers. After heavy fighting, just when things began to look somewhat peaceful for a short amount of time, arbitrary arrests of Kosovos and Reunos due to a process without lawful actions led to ultimate control of the media, broadcasting, TV, and radio. So a very violent and deep-rooted conflict then ensued. For example, in 1999, conflict heavily intensified. Serb forces established 3 sealed areas to prevent the KOA from establishing their further plans on building bases. Also due to the possible NATO invasion, tanks and heavy armor pointed right at each other along the country borders of Kosovo and directed by Kosovan and Serbian groups. In conclusion, although Fry was reacting to events from early 1998, the scale of war inside Kosovo was determined by weapons and heavy artillery. International intervention did not occur because of suppressing KOA activity, but in the way Serbs had repelled millions of people and allowing unrestricted control of police and military. The scale of the cost became disproportionate and established the transition from maintaining peace and security to waging conflict. When dealing with ethnic cleansing, the groups majorly involved include the Serbs trying to eradicate the ethnic Albanians. The roles in the conflict include, on both sides, had abuses towards civilians, which included large numbers of rape, killings, and these demonstrated terror, robbery, and destruction of major property. The nature of the involvement was very brutal and savage, resulting in forces turned on another with heavy guns and explosions. Utter chaos ensued between both sides, facing casualties and more often innocent people being hurt than those actually fighting. The conflict can be summarized in the Rakak massacre, with a KO attack on police leaving 3 policemen dead and 3 Albanians wounded, with most of the fighting occurring with machine guns, grenades, and RPGs. Due to another police attack, police brought in tanks and heavy war machines, resulting in villagers fleeing. Furthermore, in the village being set ablaze and tanks firing right into houses. After investigation, a total of 45 bodies had been found. Those bodies had been blown up, mutilated, some shot in the head, and some were tried to be hidden, buried in a ravine. In conclusion, the attempts for ethnic cleansing were brutal, bloody, and utterly savage, with both sides seeking help due to major casualties. With the actions that occurred, it turned neighbor on neighbor, friend on friend, and very quickly turned out of control and added more fuel to the fire. The United Nations, the sides involved were the United Nations and the ongoing battles between the Milosevic regime and the KLA. The UN role in the conflict was deciding who was in the wrong. The KLA had an element of uncertainty about who they were and what they represented. Milosevic was waging war against rebels, or were they pursuing full-scale ethnic cleansing? The UN had no goal or any major information on either side. It just seemed to be an everlasting war. Also, the UN had not condemned the Serbs. The UN received no interaction between each side, and even the US withdrew after January attacks. The nature of the UN involvement was also non-existent between these groups until it came to such an extreme point that they had to intervene. They had no favor towards either side due to their incoherence on what they were fighting for, ultimately seeking for an explanation and a solution on how to come to a resolution. For example, the U.S. policy met with the KLA so that they recognized their legitimacy as an organization, openly stated that Kosovo should remain part of FRI, and the utter disapproval of terrorism. So the UN sees them as a peaceful group looking towards the future in a bright way, but due to them endorsing them fighting back to remain quote-unquote safe, large amounts of terrorism ensued. So no goal or standards were set by either side, and the UN needed to figure out where they stood. In conclusion, the UN was by far too late in trying to solve this major conflict, and it's mainly due to their own lack of trying to learn. So many events had already occurred that could have been prevented if they knew which side they stood on. Finally, NATO. The individuals that were largely involved were primarily NATO and the people of Yugoslavia, in which they bombed. NATO's role in the conflict was to stop the violence that was occurring involving KLA and Yugoslavia, and to do that, they decided to bomb large parts of the city, resulting in many protests in large parts of Yugoslavia. NATO claiming only 500 deaths had occurred in their bombings, although FRI claimed over 5,500 civilians had died. And there was a steady escalation of the bombing and more buildup of ground troops in Albania. The nature in which NATO attempted to help was intended to be cleansing and helpful, and ultimately only riots and more hatred arose from the bombings. For example, Albania reached 25,000 by May 12th, and Albania deployed 25,000 troops by May 12th, and by the 25th, NATO authorized 48,000 to be deployed. Their only job was to secure other Americans, and during this time, an Apache gunship crashed in Albania on a training mission. In conclusion, the bombings, largely authorized by U.S. orders, an attempt to bring peace and a bright future, did not largely assist them or the world or that area in general. It mainly caused a larger divide and most likely a selection between American and foreign countries just simply not seeing eye to eye due to the actions done by both sides. And then my final thought on was military intervention over Kosovo justified? I personally believe that military intervention over Kosovo is for a large part justified, but not to the extent taken by NATO. I believe military intervention was critical in these two extreme sides not completely destroying one another, but with the bombings, quote unquote, I believe it opened a whole new can of worms. The bombings by NATO and soon was to be known was authorized largely by USA and attempts to end the conflict between the opposing sides. It ultimately directed a large part of their hatred towards America and American allies.